Xanthe Scharff is the CEO and co-founder of the Fuller Project, a nonprofit organization co-founded in Turkey in 2015, dedicated to reporting on women worldwide, that raises awareness, exposes injustice, and spurs accountability. Thank you very much for coming on to Global Impact. We're very happy to have you.
Thank you, Michael. So happy to be here with you.
Now, if you could introduce the Fuller Project to the listeners of Global Impact and why you felt the need to find such an organization, that would be great.
Thank you, Michael. Our vision is a news landscape that is fully representative and spurs gender equity. And while I was reporting in Turkey, it was very apparent to me how much work there was and still is to be done to get to a place where our journalism gives us what we call the full story of news, which is, for us, the full story is a story that centers on women's lived experiences, especially women whose voices are most often unheard in the stories that we read. And I come to this with a really strong feeling about the power of journalism to spur impact, because I, many years ago, was reporting a story about a family living on $1 a day in a village in Malawi. And in the story was a Nessie who had dropped out of school at 8th grade. And this story for the Christian Science Monitor led the readers to send in ultimately tens of thousands of dollars over the course of a year of reporting to ask me to help the girls. And so that changed the course of my work and life, because I focused on that for over a decade. Built an organization which continues to serve thousands of girls with educational opportunities. And so it's clear how a story can really break through and connect people. But then from that experience, I traveled around the world working for women and girls issues. And over the course of those years, met so many women on the front lines working to change their communities, very brave women who would stop at nothing to advance women and girls' rights. And I never saw those stories represented in journalism, and didn't see the stories of women in the midst of war who carry so much of the burden and advance so many solutions. And so that's why it felt so important to me to co-found this initiative that would, through really rigorous reporting, make it very evident that stories about women are for all readers, and that things that affect women affect whole societies.
And I remember a few years ago when I was working on a startup called Hum News, we chronicled or documented about 100 plus countries that were routinely left out of mainstream news coverage. Do you find that that's still very much the case? Not only are women's issues often not looked at and reported in depth, but also specific countries as well.
Yes, I think that's true. So speaking from where I am in the US in Washington, DC, of course, we're heavily influenced by politics, certainly by conflict, by economic swings. I mean, these tend to drive news cycles. And of course, depending what news you select to read, you're going to get a very different focus as well. But generally, yes, I think that's true. One of the ways that we address that is through our model, which is publishing with a great many different journalism outlets. So this year, for example, we partnered with 25 different newsrooms. And we don't want to be a US readership only organization, because we see stories about women as being very globally connected, locally connected. And that's where the real power of this story, the big story that we're telling, lies. And so in that regard, if we're publishing in Montgomery, Alabama, or if we're publishing in India or Nigeria, in that sense, we try to get away from that. Oftentimes, that narrowing of focus is driven by a national political context. We try to get outside of that.
Okay. And it's very interesting. You're growing. I saw you've added new editorial staff. You are expanding at a time when a lot of others, mainstream organizations, are shutting down. Just here in Canada, yesterday or the day before, Huffington Post Canada shut down. So if you can tell us a little bit about your business model and your funding, because it's very impressive what you're doing right now and being able to expand.
Thank you, Michael. Well, it goes back to when we started. And as we were looking around at the landscape, of course, there were newsrooms focused on women, those that had come before and were still working. And of course, there are the great investigative outfits that have been around for a long time. But we didn't see a news organization that was reporting on women at the level of reach that we believe the issue merits. And so from the beginning, my feeling was one of surprise and disappointment that there weren't more players in that space, that there wasn't more journalism, that there weren't more outlets really focused on this. And so the reason I mention that is because the need is really great. And so, the issue is really stark. I mean, when we're talking about these statistics, it will really blow you away.
Yeah.
The statistics that we have are that 1 in 4 of the people you read, hear, or see in global digital news are women. Those stats are a little bit old, but it is still the case. That's generally still the case. And we know that that's connected to representation issues inside the newsroom, of course, because it does matter who's at the table in terms of what is reported. And that is still very much an issue, with less than 3% of people working in newsrooms being Black women, for example. And so I think that the reason why we are growing is because the need is so great. And our funding model, we have support from foundations, we have support from individuals, we have support from journalism focused foundations, and we have support from issue-based funders who support us through core funding or general funding, which is a result of them seeing that if they care about issues and they care about women, then having an independent press that reaches large number of people across political divides is really vital.
And do you find, as newsroom cutbacks happen, that in the future, they're going to be even relying on more on organizations like yourself? Because, for example, I think almost on every broadcast of PBS, the NewsHour, you're now seeing something produced with foundation money or with an external organization, nonprofit. What would you see up the road in that regard?
Absolutely. If we've seen the news landscape, especially local news landscape, consolidate really significantly, which is well known and has very important impact on people's access to information, especially outside of New York and DC. So that is a loss for readers across the country, and a growing number of individuals and foundations have observed that and seen that that hurts our democracy. And it hurts people at local level who need information. They need that local service journalism. They need the investigations to ensure that their local governments are functioning. So, yes, the nonprofit news landscape is mushrooming. It's really growing. There are a lot of new initiatives, and I think it's fantastic. There's more representation. There's more issues that are being covered by expert journalists in those spaces. There are also local nonprofit newsrooms that are funded with support for the idea of having a really public service mentality. Ideally also a revenue stream, but a really public service mentality. And that's very, very different than a corporate model. So there's a huge opportunity here. Ben Smith wrote about this in the New York Times in his column and featured my friend Elizabeth Green at Chalkbeat talking about this contrast between how traditional local news is certainly in crisis, and here is this other model which is growing that needs support, needs to be paid attention to, in my view.
Where it's hard to believe, but we're at about 1 year since the global pandemic was declared. And in that time, me and a number of others have seen a difference in how people are consuming the news, especially here in North America. There seems to be much more interest, for example, in local news, because people, I think their world has become a bit smaller. But have you seen any changes in news consumption, especially in this part of the world in terms of, and I'm sorry, the other thing I'm saying is that people are understandably grappling with all sorts of issues A lot of them say, I don't watch news anymore because it makes me depressed. So how do you navigate that changing landscape in the work that you do?
Well, this year has been very important as far as gender journalism. So
Yeah.
we just marked International Women's Day,
Yep.
and it fell right at the anniversary of the shutdowns that drove women out of the industries where women are
Yeah.
very heavily represented,
Yeah.
and increased women's child care burden and caretaking burden so significantly that we saw women really driven out of the market in historic proportional rates. So that has generated a huge amount of empathy and concern for the issues that are affecting women, which are health related, economic related, obviously, which has been very gendered. And then also there are these other range of issues that are connected to health and economics, for instance, domestic violence, that have increased during COVID. So while I'm sure people are turning off some of the really negative news and trying to disconnect because we're all trying to survive in a way, but people who care about the issues that we report on are very engaged.
Okay. And I have to say the amazing work you've done, as you pointed out, during the COVID crisis. So I've seen stories, for example, I mean, it's hard to believe figure 200% surge in links to child abuse material posted online. Migrant workers in Saudi Arabia laid off and unable to get home, documents taken away. California nail salon workers facing ruin, evictions in the US and the impact on women, and of course, women's health in the pandemic and that triple burden we've read so much about of childcare, industry layoffs, and lack of protections at work. What was the one kind of surprising discovery, if we can put it that way, that you found in this pandemic in terms of the way it impacted women that you might have not have expected?
That's a great question. One of the things that we've seen is women finding new ways to communicate. So, for example, in the reporting that our team has done around global migrant workers, so there's almost 12 million global migrant workers, and these are almost all women that we're reporting on. These are women who are going into domestic work abroad. Many of these women are coming from the Philippines. Many of them are going to the Middle East. And what we found in the course of reporting is that because of COVID, women have moved more fully into Facebook in order to communicate with each other and to pass potentially life-saving tips with one another. And so that online community has been a place that has informed our reporting as well. So that has been different, and we'll continue to report on that and hope that folks will follow that story as it evolves, because the way that women connect with each other around the world has been a constant in communities over time, that women find ways to connect, whether it's around the water pump or in the case of nannies in parks while watching kids and passing notes that way. And now moving on to Facebook or onto TikTok really does create some opportunities for solidarity that are important.
We do have a lot of listeners on Global Impact in North America. Can you zoom in a little bit on the story you did on what I mentioned, the California nail salon workers? How has COVID impacted them? Because that's, I think, quite an interesting one as well.
Yeah, this was a story that we worked with the San Francisco Chronicle on, given that it was a local story to the community, and it was actually very well read on their site. There were a lot of people concerned and interested in the story, and it talks about nail workers who women may interact with frequently and how difficult it has been. That's, of course, an industry that has faced a lot of shutdown and constriction when it has opened back up. And it's the story of women who were income insecure before the crisis and are now trying to navigate that. And I think that is very much a Fuller Project story, in the sense that we're working with editors and readers to take them beyond that first story that they may be very focused on, which is from the perspective of their own lives. All of us are suffering with caretaking responsibilities and just trying to figure out how to keep the family and the kids safe. And there is another more vulnerable population that is dealing with much more complicated aspects of risk And then, of course, any workers who are undocumented, this now becomes much more difficult and threatening situation during the pandemic. We also did a story which was about farm workers on the border in California as well. And this was reporting about women who were picking blueberries, the same blueberries that people are eating in the local community. And as schools shut down and they didn't have places to take their children, they were bringing their children to the fields.
Wow.
The children were working. And our reporter also heard from her sources that they were bringing cradles into the field and putting those down next
Wow.
in order to continue working. So these are the dire straits that people are in. But that connection of the women who have done your nails or the women who are picking the fruit that you're eating to stay healthy during the pandemic is so important, so that we can take that empathy we have for our friends and the people around us and extend it to other communities, any and every other community around the world. We can understand the complexity of this crisis. And what it really reveals is the problems that were in the system long before the pandemic hit, and how inequities that were already there open up into even greater cleavages in the society that we share.
Yeah, and I saw that not only are you spotlighting important issues like that, but it has spurred change, legislative change, different improved practices in the workplace, things like that, hasn't it?
It
A lot of your
definitely
story.
does. Yeah, while we're talking about California, we reported a story very early in the crisis, which was it told the story of a woman in California who was going in to deliver her child. And this is a mother who had received a grant to have a doula come with her into the birth. And this was important because this was a Black mother who had concerns about the mortality rates that disproportionately impact Black mothers when they're giving birth. And when she went to the hospital, she wasn't allowed to bring her doula in. And this created, of course, a lot of anxiety and a feeling that the hospital wasn't explaining some policies, including a new policy that inductions would be scheduled earlier in the process, so 39 weeks that hadn't been explained. And this did lead to a release of a new statement about why that 39-week induction policy was being brought forward, it was just backed by research, but needed to be explained to patients. Our reporting on maternal health had also been cited by senior policymakers, including Senator Cory Booker and many others, which went in a letter to encourage maternal care in the stimulus spending. And recently allocations for maternal care have been announced, actually.
Okay. The Philippines, a country I've worked in as a journalist and lived there, you did a story not too long ago, I believe it was on virginity testing, and that's still going on there. Can you tell us a little bit about that one?
Yeah, this was a major investigation that was led by our global editor, Sophia Jones, over the course of a year. Actually started in Afghanistan, where she was reporting and learned about and talked to women who were in prison and then had been charged based on the results of virginity tests, which we know to be a sham.
Right.
Virginity is a concept, it's not a medical reality. And so it's the testing and the myth around the hymen are used to indict women. And when she heard about this, she got concerned and interested in this topic and began to ask about where else it may be happening globally, and quickly learned that it happens in the US. And so reporting on this issue in the US was very challenging because naturally it's hard to have sources come forward. Yeah. And eventually she did have a doctor on record talking about performing these sham tests and the reasons why girls or women are subjected to them. And she did talk with women who had been subjected to them much earlier in their lives as well. And in the US, it drove tremendous impact, actually, and in the Philippines as well. So in the US, this came out in a 4-part series that we did in partnership with Mary Claire. And it was heavily researched, including research into the myth of the hymen, what the hymen is, and that it doesn't always, it's not always there. It isn't something that can be medically tested for as any kind of sexual activity. And so After she published, the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology published a first ever statement that said that this medical practice is not valid. And a famous rapper in the US, T.I. the rapper, made a statement, coincidentally, that he forced his daughter to undergo virginity testing. And this came out concurrent to the reporting. What followed that was a major reckoning in which he was confronted on social media by scores and scores of women.
Yeah.
And there were 40 articles, at least 40 that I counted, written about this. And the benefit was that those articles, many of them referenced Sophia's reporting, which was so meticulously done. And so what could have been a cultural conversation and this is wrong or we don't support this, but without that rooting in medical research and evidence and sources, it became a very serious conversation. And in fact, when T.I. the rapper was confronted in a really important show in the US, we know that that show had reached out and engaged with the reporting. We did then see New York and California introduce legislation to ban the practice. In the Philippines, Corinne Redfern contributed this reporting to the story about how in an area in the red light district, pimps were sending girls and women to go and have these tests. And if they supposedly passed the test, they would have a card with a red V on it, which would then be used to charge more for having sex with these women. And when that was reported on, the government hospitals that were the government health clinics that were issuing those cards stopped doing that.
Wow. And it's interesting. I mean, fascinating the stories you're doing. I wanted to put this to you. Another impact of COVID on journalism is I've got to tell you, no matter what major news organization I talk to, I have friends in many of those. The bar now on foreign reporting has been raised very, very high because of risk mitigation, that sort of thing. It seems that a lot of major news organizations are just not sending reporters out to the field. Your reporting continues. It continues to make impact. You continue to get your reporters out there. How do you navigate that? Because there is, of course, higher risk. Borders are closing, flights being canceled, that sort of thing. So how is that working for you?
Yeah. So of course, in the early stage of the pandemic, no one was moving and we had reporters who were not in a place where they could access their own medical insurance or had other circumstances. And so we did need to move people before borders closed and that sort of thing. So our first response was just security and health for everyone, make sure all the bases are covered. And we're not the first to send people back out to the field. We're not, the New York Times or another major operation that has a massive kind of security apparatus behind it. What we did was really double down on our reporting with local reporters. And it's so important anyway, and it's really baked into our model, but it did give us the opportunity to bring additional focus to that. And so we have expanded the reporting that we've done with reporters who are in country, and we do that through a co-bylining process very often, where we'll have one of our core reporters who has an expertise that's based on gender and global sources and research and having done a range of stories in their portfolio over the years, but also the stories coming from the ground, whether it's coming from Kenya, where we have a large partnership and work with a lot of reporters, specifically supported the launch of the first gender desk at a newsroom in the region at The Nation paper, which publishes in Tanzania and Uganda as well as Kenya. And so we work with the reporters out of that newsroom as well. And so we're not moving people around. And this is one of the things that's come out of COVID, which is truly important. And I have talked to other newsroom leaders. Certainly the struggle to have reporting from the ground is one that is shared. And so the emphasis and importance of local reporters is being better understood. And sometimes these are reporters who are referred to as fixers. And the reliance on these individuals to bring these stories to the fore at this really critical moment is very evident, more evident. And so I think that is a really positive outcome.
And the other thing I've been documenting during COVID is how strongmen and dictators have reacted or used it, if we can put it that way. Many putting in draconian measures to level the playing field in their favor. And I've talked to some journalists out in the field of Ukraine, Turkey, and elsewhere, and they've talked about things, for example, court hearings being closed permanently to public scrutiny on the premise of COVID, draconian curfews, movement restrictions. Have your reporters out in the field felt those and that restraint that comes from those types of actions?
Definitely. Definitely. And these moments expose how much a leader is really committed to transparency and democratic process. And it comes in and it can restrict everyone's freedoms. And then of course the people who are most vulnerable to begin with are going to be on the other end of that most clearly. But we did report in Uganda on domestic violence and how that was affected by transport ban, because the story actually followed some frontline responders and activists who would hear that there was a domestic incident going on and then look to bring that person out of the home. So usually that would be a woman, but not always, of course. And so going to that home and trying to deliver that woman to a safe shelter or something of that nature. And because of the transport ban, moving someone who's looking to provide support or response is taking an enormous risk of being stopped and detained by police. And this is in the context of Museveni, President of Uganda Museveni, saying that domestic violence just simply is not a priority during the pandemic. And we know that domestic violence often leads to fatal incidents.
Yeah.
And so a life is life. But when you have a statement like that from a president who is explicitly deprioritizing an issue that is so heavily gendered and uniformly experienced by huge swaths of women around the world, in every country, certainly including Uganda, it really does send a message. It sends a message to police. It sends a message that people hear culturally in society and in homes that's incredibly damaging and hard to come back from.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's also important. I mean, the issues you talked about, for example, how women are impacted by COVID, are male reporters starting to take an interest in some of these issues and reporting on them thoroughly, and our male assignment editors, prioritizing some of these issues as well?
Yes, definitely. We work with a number of male editors who are very interested in these stories and very committed to bringing more representation into the stories and into the network of people that they work with to report the stories. So certainly we have a huge number of partners. I mean, we work with hundreds of editors and journalists around the world. And it is true that more women come to us in order to work with us because of a connection to the mission, but we certainly also have people of all gender identities coming to us wanting to tell these stories. And it does depend upon the reporter skill. And what we consider great journalism is journalism that can capture these stories, can do it sensitively, can do it with the integrity of the source in mind, with the self-identity of the source in mind as well. And a great journalist can do that. And actually, I think all editors want that. Where we've had barriers is that there hasn't been an investment or really robust support for the idea that reporting about women has been missed and therefore needs a special emphasis in order for people to be able to do this issue area justice. So of course, if you go into a newsroom, you're going to see a politics desk that's robustly supported. You're going to see a labor desk. You're going to see an investigative outfit. And at this point in our society and in the journalism landscape, you need to see a serious gender desk because the issues are backed by research, backed by sources. You've got to have a network. You've got to have trust. You have to have an understanding of how the issues are connected. And we don't see that. We'll see, when we see gender coverage, which is a very small fraction of coverage, right? I mean, when we see that, we will often see it siloed into a particular issue, like a workplace issue. Whereas for those of us who work on it in depth, we know that none of these issues exist in a silo, right? Like the pandemic shows that very, very clearly. A health issue is going to quickly turn into an economic issue, is going to quickly turn into a safety issue. When we report, for example, on environment and climate, which is an important issue area for us, where we don't see a lot of reporting that's focused on gender, we know that that's tied to migration. We know that it's tied to farming. It has so many different connections that can help us to understand not just that, something terrible happened, or that, there's a woman who has experienced injustice, but also we can understand the history and the context and the system. That's really the only way that we're going to move forward on these issues.
Okay. And we talked at the beginning a bit about how people are consuming the news. Do you find you're having to adapt your reporting or your presentation of reporting quite a bit for this so-called always-on online generation, consuming a lot of their news on mobile phones? Because I'm seeing, for example, the big guys like the BBCs of the world doing a lot more infographics, 30-second videos. I heard a statistic a few months ago that for a typical op-ed piece, 800 words or so, people are spending under a minute on it. How is that impacting you?
Well, it's a two-part answer. The first is that our journalism really is investigative and enterprise journalism, and that's where we add value. It's not quick hit pieces that, we're not the breaking news newsroom. We're not focused on that. We may be the fifth day story. We are the people who aim to be on the ground before that, that group of journalists come in to tell a story and then move on to another story. We are on the ground telling the long story, and after publishing a story, very often staying and following up and reporting on that story as it evolves. So that is the core of our work. And of course, we just published a very long, in today's terms, piece with 1843 that was beautifully reported by Corinne Redfern and very nuanced, about a woman in Bangladesh who had been trafficked into sex work and had moved through the brothels in Bangladesh and then grew up, and both was working very hard to stop child trafficking, but also had amassed some power inside of that system. And so it was actually in the system that she was fighting to work against. That's a story of tremendous nuance. Not everyone is going to have time to read it. It's not a simple headline at all. But for the issues that we work on, we're trying to, in many cases, raise awareness. I mean, who's read that story before? And so just as a baseline, we want these stories to be out there and to have those who are interested to engage in a significant way to have the information. So we continue to do that. That's a true north for us. At the same time, of course, modes of communication are really important. We want to meet people where they are, and 30-second videos on social media are important. We do a lot of interesting things on social media, threads. We just shared a graphic through our newsletter and through our social media accounts, which is showing the globe. And then as you click on different parts of the globe, different countries, it takes you to different parts of our reporting. So even if you're not going to read the 2,000 word piece, you're going to see, 100 words about each, and you're going to get the idea of global reporting about women and how it's connected. So we try to accomplish both of those things, I would say. And, our Instagram account is different than our Twitter account, and trying to meet people where they are in that regard.
Yeah, I saw the interactive feature. It's brilliant, and spent a lot of time and very engaging. It's a great move. I wanted to kind of start wrapping up, not to take too much of your time. There's been a lot of criticism about big tech, the Facebooks, Googles of the world, the battle going on in Australia right now over usage of news from local papers there and not being paid for it. Have you had any success in terms of collaboration with some of the big tech institutions, like, for example, Facebook, in terms of amplifying your stories and getting them out there?
That's a great question. Actually, it's one that nonprofit newsrooms struggle with a lot. And Facebook gives funding and gave funding out in the beginning of the pandemic to news organizations. And there was a lot of discussion among some who wanted to take the funding and some who didn't. Of course, Facebook is important for getting stories out to readers. Actually, it's not an area of emphasis for us at the moment, but it is also very important for sourcing.
Yeah.
So I would say at this point for us, it's more important for sourcing because we have to connect with our sources where they are. And in some cases, people read their news there. There's community organizing that's going on there. There's groups that our reporters may be invited into. And so it is really important. Facebook is really important in some of the reporting. That's also true for other platforms like TikTok. Um, Twitter is very helpful for amplifying the reporting, especially among the editor and journalist community. So as you said, in today's world, yeah, we need these platforms to meet people where they are. The extent to which they're having an impact on journalism and potentially harming the journalism space is something that editors are constantly talking about and trying to walk that line.
Okay. And kind of to wrap up, benefiting from the reporting you've done, the people you've highlighted, especially women who are in many cases in dire circumstances, here in North America and around the world, I put this to many of our guests, there's so many people at the end of the rope of hope, if I can put it that way, being furloughed, having incredible demands put on them. And we've talked a bit of the impact on women. You've probably thought over the months about particular women you've highlighted, particular cases, but what would be kind of your overall message of hope, if we can put it that way, to people who are in dire circumstances and don't know what's going to happen tomorrow? Is there anything you can say to that?
The hope is that we learn lessons from this experience, and the data about the inequality that predated the pandemic is now very stark. It's limited in scope, but what we have is very, very stark. We certainly know that infection rates fell along racial injustice and racial inequality lines. We know that the economic crisis fell heavily on women. And we have an opportunity for people to better understand that reality. And what we're looking to do is continue that drumbeat reporting and deepen it and bring more data to the table, so that rather than having, a time-bound acknowledgement of this, actually decision makers are held accountable to respond to that and to craft better policies around that, and community members have the information that they need in order to continue their organizing and communicate about these issues and get attention for them.
Okay. And if you could tell our listeners where they could view your material, and if they want to support your efforts, how do they do that?
Thank you so much. We're a public service journalism organization, so our work is fueled by donations, and those can be made on our website, which is fullerproject.org. And also you can sign up for our newsletter there, which is the best way to consistently hear from us, hear from our newsroom, and also understand our organization as well. So we always share our journalism there. But please also follow us. We're on Twitter at Fuller Project. We're on Instagram, Fuller Project, and on Facebook as well. And look forward to hearing from you all, hearing your interest and response to our reporting as well.
Great answer. And thank you so much for your time. Congratulations on what you've achieved so far. I mean, above all, we wish you and your team, and especially the staff out there in the field doing this incredible work, safety. And we look forward to reading more groundbreaking reporting from you. Xanthe Scharff, the CEO and co-founder of the Fuller Project. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael.